Hello everybody, this is International Master Sam Shankland, and today I'm going to start a new series for chess.com about building your opening repertoire. So I'm not actually going to look at many openings this series. I'm more just going to talk about what kind of things you should consider when choosing what openings you play. The first thing I'd like to point out is that most people watching this video are probably not that high rated yet, and they're still trying to improve their game and maybe don't have such a solid opening repertoire right now. I remember I didn't really have an opening repertoire that I viewed as solid until I was about 2300, and even now there's still some holes in my repertoire that I'm trying to patch up. But there is one really important thing, and that's that you have to create a sound foundation. For example, I see when people are rated, anywhere between, let's say, 800 and 1400, I see a lot of openings like this one. E4, E5, Knight F3, and F5, which is very tricky. It's good against low-rated players. They likely will mess up here. They're not going to know the theory. And you might score some good wins with it. But when it comes down to it, this is not a fundamentally sound opening. And when you get to high levels and get to play against players who are really going to be able to and capable of playing well against this, you're going to find yourself running into a lot of trouble. For example, about a year ago, or maybe 2 years, I played the white side of this against a master rated about 2250. And I played knight takes e5, queen f6, g4. This is still all basically mainline stuff. d6, knight c4, f takes e4, knight c3, queen g6. And now, in some cases, some white players might not exactly know what to do here. And it's true if black's given time, maybe he'll be able to play moves like knight f6, d5, bishop d6, get all his pieces out and sort of have a built-in attack on the king side because of this strong pawn wedge on e4. And of course, if white plays knight d5, black will just play queen f7, defending the pawn and hitting the knight and preparing to push through with d5. But in this game, I just played f3. And now it looks like black's center is just going to be completely torn apart, and he's really not fit to defend this position. For example, if e takes f3, queen takes f3, and white's next move is bishop d3, and then he castles, and he's going to quickly get a huge initiative because he's just up so much development, because black's been wasting time with his queen. And after f3, knight f6, for example, here f takes e4 is very powerful because now queen e2, I think, just wins a piece, because there's no way to really break the pin. If black plays d5, then knight takes d5 is maybe black can save a piece, but he's not going to save his king. So I think black's just lost now. So there's different levels of fundamentally sound openings. For example, black could play on move 1, f5, which is probably the most unsound move he can play, and after e takes f5, just have a horrible position. So that's an extremely unsound opening, but there's some that are totally fine, but once you really get up to higher levels, they might not be so good. Like, let's say, sort of like the variation we just looked at, which was the Latvian gambit. This one here is called the Schliemann defense. And it's very tough to deal with over the board, but against a very well-prepared and I don't quite want to say well-educated, but strong opponent who's capable of finding good moves over the board, I think it's quite likely that black will find himself in a worse position. So even if this can last you for a while, once you get to be really strong, and this can't last you, and you have to learn a whole new opening, it's going to take up a lot of energy, and you're going to have to deal with a lot of painful losses. I remember when I first learned the Najdorf, one of my first games ever with it, I lost in, I think, something like 25 moves to a player rated 150 points below me. So you usually want to be able to have a solid set of openings where you don't have to be changing it because it's unsound, like this opening, for example. And it can go even higher. Like if you look, there's this opening, the Sicilian Dragon, which now is being played at top levels still. But theoretically, it's supposed to be suspect because white can often just get such a powerful attack on the king side in the Yugoslav attack. Now, there hasn't been too much published recently about the improvements that are coming at these top 2700 level games where black seems to be at least mostly holding his own. Recently I saw a game just a couple of days ago where Fabiano Caruana, playing black, played a tough game against Evgeny Alexeyev, and that game ended in a draw, although I think there were definitely points in the game where both sides had an advantage. There was times where white was better, times where black was better, and it ended up in being a draw. But the point is, the Dragon also, while being played at top levels now, is still somewhat theoretically suspect. If you look at Carlsen's games, he tends to do all right in the Dragon when he beat Rajabov very nicely a while ago. But he's played it against Anand and against Topalov, and in both cases, he just got completely slaughtered because Carlsen's a very, very strong player, but maybe still Topalov and Anand are equally strong, or probably a little bit better. And if Carlsen plays a theoretically suspect opening like the Dragon, he may run into some trouble because he won't be able to outplay his opponents the way he can against, I guess, if such a term exists, weaker 2700 players. So there's a few openings that can be played. There's a lot of choice. There's many variations that are fundamentally sound, but you have to also be able to play a position you're comfortable with. So, for example, if you want to play e4 for white, you have to be able to build a repertoire that covers, let's say, the French defense, the Caro-Kann defense, the open games, usually the Roy Lopez, and the Sicilian defense. And of course, there's always other moves that you have to be ready for, like a modern, or a Pierce, or an Aliekin. There's lots of sort of, I guess, not as mainstream openings that one always has to be ready for when they're playing a move like e4 or d4 or anything that really is a normal, like, main opening. So while you may run into trouble in some of these sidelines, over time you'll begin to learn them. And once you play one game and you fall for one trick or you don't get an advantage, you'll study it and you'll figure out what happened, and it won't happen in the future. One thing I experienced was when I was a lot younger, I was just basically playing for tricks. I played the Accelerated Dragon mostly, which goes as follows: e4, c5, knight f3, d6, knight c6, d4, d4, knight takes d4, g6. And now there were a lot of little traps you can play here. For example, I don't remember too many of them, but if knight c3, trying to head towards more of a Yugoslav kind of attack, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6. Here, if f3, which is sort of a, I guess, normal move for a Yugoslav, castles, queen d2, black plays d5. And in the regular Dragon, black will often they'll often have this position, white castles, and black plays d5 now, which is, although I think white probably still is slightly better, black has a dangerous initiative, and if he's a better player, will probably win the game. But black can play d5 in this position, a tempo faster, and an opening as sharp as the Dragon, he's going to have an excellent position. But white will probably play bishop c4 here. And now castles, and bishop b3 is the best move. Because if f3, then black plays queen b6, another little trick. And it's hard to see what white's going to do now, because this pawn on b2 is under attack. If he plays a move like bishop b3 to defend it, maybe black can play knight takes e4, hitting this knight on d4. And if that's and although there is some theory here after white plays knight d5, I think queen a5 checks c3, white's supposedly okay, although I don't think he can get more than the quality. I think that Knight g4 will definitely yield black an advantage because he can meet knight d5 with knight takes e3. And after f takes g4, bishop takes d4, it's clear that black is in the driver's seat. He's messed up white's pawn structure, and white has weak dark squares. And so after bishop b3, there's lots of things black can do, but one of them is, let's say, d5. E takes d5 and knight b4. Or, okay, I'm sorry. Black will play a5. And if white plays a4 now, black plays d5, takes, and knight b4. And it's very complicated. And I don't know too much about what's going on. I think after a5, f3 is a move too. After which, again, d5 followed by knight b4. The point is, white doesn't want to allow black to play a4, bishop a4, knight e4, winning the bishop pair and taking some space in the center. But one thing white can do is, let's say, queen e2, a4, knight a4, knight e4, and then knight b5, threatening bishop b6, rook a6, and queen e2. And while black has gained some center, white can follow up with moves like c4, holding down black's center, and maybe even push c5 in some cases. And he's going to have nice homes for his rooks on the d and d files, and black's going to be under some pressure. So while there's a lot of tricks, if white knows what he's doing, he gets a good position this way. And I think more importantly, white gets a good position by playing c4 now, and going for a Maroczy bind, where if he knows what he's doing, he'll just kind of be able to squeeze black, and black will always have very little space, and this is why you don't see the accelerated drag in the top 2700 level games, is because of c4. For example, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop e2, castle. White just has more space in a pleasant position. His next moves may be something like queen d2 and rook d1, and it's hard to see what black's really going to play in the future. White may eventually try to put a knight on d5. He'll play rook c1. He's got a very solid position. He can try to play c5. There's a lot of things white can do while black is still hurting for plans. And when I had to change that, it was very hard, and I'm still learning some intricacies of the knight arc, although I feel I know it a lot better now. So, against e4, black has a few choices. There's a lot of fundamentally sound openings nowadays. There's the French defense, and you've got to be able to think, I'm probably going to play a closed position with the French, although there's definitely ways of playing it more aggressively. For example, after d4, d5, the French actually is probably one of the easier ones to learn because there's really only three, I think, reasonable, important moves here, and those are e5, knight c3, and knight d2. And, for example, after knight d2, if black plays knight f6, e5, knight d7, bishop d3, c5, c3, knight c6, we're getting a relatively closed position. And if this is something black wants and is comfortable with a position like this one, then he should go for it. I think white probably is going to have a slight advantage here, like he does in many openings, but this is definitely a fine choice to play for black. Or if black wants to play the French defense but wants to make it a little more open, in this position black can try c5, which opens the game up a bit. White can play ed5, and now black can choose to either have an isolated queen pawn structure or a queen takes d5 with another structure after knight f3, cd4, bishop c4, etc. So there's lots of ways to create an opening repertoire, but what you really have to figure out is, what do you feel comfortable with? I know a lot of young players might not be too happy with the French defense. For example, after e5, there's not too much play going on immediately. It's not like the position's already fizzled out to nothingness because we're only, 3-4 moves into the game. But it's not clear what really the plans are just yet. You have to wait and see. There's a lot of positional maneuvering before anything really goes down that quickly. If this is the case, then maybe you'd want to consider playing the Sicilian defense. So there's lots of ways of playing the Sicilian defense. And you can play sort of an e6 system where you play for, I guess you could play like a6 now for sort of a con system. You could play knight c6, which is a Paulson, or you could even play something like knight f6, knight c3, and now d6, which is going to be a Scheveningen. And you have to be able to know sort of the positional intricacies of moves like bishop e2, bishop e3, castle kingside. This is a relatively common plan. But I guess a little bit more important to know is g4, the carries attack, which is a very dangerous plan for white, but if handled correctly, black can probably get a playable game. So you've got to be able to figure, are you content with these positions as black, where you're solid and maybe have long-term better pawn structure and better prospects there, but white's ahead in development and maybe going to start attacking you? Or do you want to always be the one on attack? You know, there's openings that are, I guess, sort of less sound, but still acceptable and played on high levels, like this opening here called the Sveshnikov defense. You've got to be able to figure here, if you look, black has a weak square on d5 and a weak pawn on d6, but in a lot of concrete variations, he gets some initiative. For example, bishop g5, a6. This point is this knight has to go back to a3, which is a bad square. This knight will be good on d5, but this knight is going to be terrible on a3. Black plays b5 to keep the knight out off of c4. Knight d5, bishop e7, bishop f6, bishop f6, c3. And there's lots of ways of playing this position, but one really sharp one, which has mostly gone out of popularity, is knight e7. And after knight f6, gf6. Black's king is always going to be a little exposed, but he has breaks with d5 or f5 in the center, maybe with bishop b7 first. Eventually he'll bring his king to the queen side, or maybe even the king side. There's definitely plans to be implemented. And it's a very sharp position where a lot of things are really going on right now. There's calculation. You know, you've got to know your openings well with the computer. Whereas in, let's say, the French defense or the Roy Lopez, you don't have to know it as well. So it's almost like a personality test to begin with as to what opening you want to play. So you've got to figure, you know, most of you have played chess a few times before. You've got to figure, how do I usually win my games? Do I usually win by playing tactically? Do I usually win by, you know, creating a slow plan and squeezing my opponent? In which case, as white, you might consider playing moves like d4 or knight f3. Or, you know, if I'm really technical, again, d4, knight f3. If I like sharp positions, e4. And then you have to build a repertoire based on that. So, for example, let's say I take an opening that I historically have had trouble with, the Alekhine's defense. So I'm playing the white pieces now. And I've got to figure out how am I going to build a repertoire, because I've been playing e4 for most of my life. But the Alekhine has always kind of been a little thorn in my side. And I recently played a game in this tournament in Chicago where I tried out a new variation. Historically, I'd always been playing extremely aggressively with an opening called the four pawns attack, which is named for obvious reasons, because white moves all his pawns forward without moving any of his pieces first. And I actually won a game with this opening recently at the Philadelphia International to make my second GM norm. It was the final round. But I don't think this opening is particularly good for white if black knows what he's doing. Like that game that I won there continued d takes e5, f takes e5, knight c6, attacking these pawns in the center. I can't advance d5 because of knight takes e5, so I have to defend my d4 pawn. But if I play knight f3, then black plays bishop g4, and again I'm in another dilemma. This bishop is on a perfect square. So in the game, I played the best move, bishop e3, which defends this pawn but doesn't let the bishop come to g4 just yet. And black can't really find a good waiting move in the meantime, because if he plays e6 to get his bishop out, well, that blocks this other bishop. So it's hard to find another waiting move. Black doesn't want to develop his bishop to g7 because it would just look stupid there. It's biting on a bunch of pawns that can't really be removed. So in the game, black actually played bishop f5. And now he maybe has ideas of playing knight b4. So I play knight c3, ready to meet knight b4 with rook c1. So black plays e6, and now I played knight f3. Now he wastes, quote-unquote, wastes the tempo and plays bishop g4. But when I looked at this position, I didn't really feel like I had an advantage. I thought black was already doing totally fine. And I would realize, against really good players like the one I was playing, Daniel Fernandez, I can't really play like variations like this one and expect to get anything out of the opening. Or, even this position, I would probably prefer to be black because the plans are easier. You play queen d7, you castle queenside, maybe you play bishop e7 and f6. White center looks powerful at the moment, but it can't really be moved forward because d5 can't ever be achieved because everything hangs. If c5, then white just loses the key square of d5. For example, if white plays on like c5 now, knight d5, black gets access to this really important d5 square, and black has easy plans to attack this white center. So I don't think I would feel comfortable playing this position as white, even if objectively speaking, maybe white's actually doing okay or is equal. So recently I had figured, maybe I should learn something else against the Alekhine, and so I did. I learned this move knight f3, which is much more positional, it's much calmer, and that game continued d takes e5, knight takes e5, g6, bishop e2, bishop g7, castle, castle, and now c4, knight b6, knight c3, and pretty soon I got a reasonable space advantage, and I ended up winning the game pretty easily. I didn't need to find any crazy tactics or anything like I did against Fernandez. For example, the game continues c6, bishop f4, bishop e6, black's now threatening to take on e5 and then on c4, after which I played b3, knight d7, and this is actually a good point too, part of choosing your opening repertoire is getting not only positions that you're comfortable with, but positions you understand. Like, for example, in this position, I'd have to understand that there's only one move that white can play that will keep an advantage, and that's knight f3, which looks strange, moving the knight back to where it originally took e5 from. But circumstances have changed because right now black's pieces are extremely cramped, and black can't connect his rooks, and because white has more space, it's in his interest not to trade pieces. So you might say, well, I don't want to go back to f3, I want to go back somewhere else. Well, where? g4 just looks extremely silly. Among other things, black may be able to just take this knight and follow up with e5, freeing some of his game, and opening this powerful bishop on g7. So, and if knight d3, well then white's just going to have a bad position because he loses his pawn on d4. So this was, in general, a better opening choice against the Alekhine, I think, regardless of what style of play you want, because it's more fundamentally sound. And this opening will probably be able to last me my entire life. And that's important because learning a new opening in the middle of your chess career is very hard, and it will definitely cost you some key points against weaker players that you normally wouldn't give up. So I think it will be much better to, after e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4, d6, to learn this move knight f3 first, instead of learning c4. So one thing that is going to be hard to figure out for lower players is, what openings are fundamentally sound. Someone might say, well, I'm 1300, I don't exactly know, what's going to really be like the best way to play, because I'm not sure. What I've been playing seems fine. I don't see any reason not to play this way. Well, and sometimes it's even hard to know if it's okay or not okay. So in these cases, I would say try to look up what the grandmasters are playing nowadays, the really top players. And you don't need to play all the exact main lines. There's some very popular variations nowadays. Like, for example, one really popular one is this variation where this is the Queen's Indian, where white sacrifices a pawn on d5, and it's very complicated, very theoretical. You don't necessarily need to play this variation because it happens to show up, I don't know if this is true, but more often than any other variation at, top GM 2700 level. But you can say, if in this position, I've seen knight c3 before too at top level. This is a fine move. I can play this move. It's a different kind of position, and I'm happy to play it. You can say, even if d4 has become more popular, e4 has been played on top levels. And now, as black, if I want to play against e4, mostly, I think the majority of the games are now continuing e5. Black plays the Roy Lopez and is usually holding draws pretty easily, but At club level, people aren't just going to randomly be able to hold a draw with the Roy Lopez the way 2700 is. And even then, there's definitely some games where 2700s loses black in the Roy Lopez. It's still a rich opening with much to be discovered. But also, you don't need to play the Roy Lopez. You can realize, you know what, people also play the Najdorf at top levels. I mean, you look at this guy, Lanier Dominguez. He's been a real Najdorf buff, and he's won a lot of great games. There was one in particular I remember over Evgeny Alexeyev that I thought was extremely nice. You know, Karyakin has played the Najdorf many times. There's many openings that you can choose in these situations. But you should probably choose one that at least has some presence in top-level games. So one question I've been asked a lot about this is, you know, I'm not going to know this opening so well right away. You know, I'm probably just going to lose some games. Well, this is true, but this is going to happen if you have to change your opening someday anyway. And that's probably something you'd rather have happen sooner rather than later. Because if you really understand an opening, then you're not going to need to prepare as much later on. For example, let's say the Catalan. It goes, which will, by the traditional move order, goes like this. Knight f3, knight f6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2. So there's lots of variations in the Catalan, but I'm just going to look at this one in particular. D takes c4, queen c2, a6, and queen takes c4, b5, queen c2. And if you look at this position, after bishop b7, bishop d2, there's a ton of moves black can play here. There's knight c6, there's knight bd7, there's bishop d6, there's rook a7. There's plenty of things black can do in this position. Now, if you're going to play this as white, at first it's going to be completely overwhelming to try to figure out what to do against every single black response. But if you can really understand this position well and learn what you should do, then you'll be able to probably get an advantage in a lot of your games, and even the absolute best preparation won't be able to defeat you. So while this may result in some tough losses, I remember I played a game in a variation like this one, where my opponent played, I believe, bishop e4, queen b3, and then knight c6, attacking this pawn on d4, and then, the game went rook a7, rook e1, bishop e4, and now knight c6, attacking this pawn on d4, e3, queen a8. Now there's threats along this long diagonal, so I figured I should probably bring my queen back to defend. And b4, and I ran into a lot of trouble because I didn't understand what I could do, because this knight on b1 doesn't have any good squares right now, and it's hard to see how white's going to continue to play this game. But as it turns out, while I lost that game, I figured out now that white should play bishop e1 and then follow it up with knight bd2. White should play queen f1 and now follow up with bishop f1, knight bd2, and then eventually move this knight on f3 away. And then this weak c-file will come into play for black. There's always weak points on this c-file, all these weak squares, and this weak pawn on b4. And so long term, black has a lot of weaknesses. And while I didn't understand this at the time, now that I do, if I get this kind of position again, I'm going to be much better equipped to play it correctly. And if that happens, then I think I'm very confident in my ability to score a full point. And this is the way you want to be for all of your games, to really feel comfortable in the opening you play. Like I have a friend, Josh Friedel, who also does videos here at chess.com, and he plays the black side of the Roy Lopez. And he almost never needs to prepare against e4 because he understands these systems so well. You know, he'll play, let's say, he can play this way, he can play the Berlin defense, but let's say he plays sort of like a standard Lopez. You know, he doesn't need, his opponent can know that he'll play this position as black. His opponent can have this position on their computer, you know, an hour before the game starts, and he still won't be able to, you know, get anything significant with white because Josh knows his stuff and knows his ideas very well here. He's been playing it his entire life. He's played probably 150 games as black in the Roy Lopez, and since he understands his ideas, even the best opening preparation can't beat him because it's a fundamentally sound opening. It's not one where preparation can just win the game because black is very solid and is not just going to lose because white turned on the computer for longer. So that's basically what you have to think about to start out an opening repertoire. You've got to think, I've got to get positions that I'm comfortable with, and they have to be fundamentally sound. And creating an opening repertoire is a very hard thing to do, but that's the real core aspect of it, is to get positions that you like to play, and you want a sound repertoire. You don't want to be playing the Latvian gambit and the Alban counter gambit as black, or playing the King's gambit as white, and the Veresov or something. It's just, or the Smith Mora. It's, while they might be good at club level, they're not going to really serve you well down the road. So that's going to end my first video on this topic, and I will talk to you again for a second one later. Thanks. This is Sam Shankland.